Welcome to another video in our basic networking course. We're going to be covering network address translation. Basically, that's a way that we can translate our private IP addresses into public ones so that they can access the internet. And we can also use this to redirect traffic via port forwarding. So some things we need to understand about private versus public IPs. Private IPs are internal to a network. They're not routable because they're not unique on the open internet. You might send out a private IP to the open internet and it might end up in somebody else's network matching one of their IPs. So that's why they aren't routable on the open internet. And these have helped us extend the life of IPv4, which is being replaced by IPv6. So here's the list of private IP address ranges. You've got the 10 network, the 172.16 to 172.31 networks, the 192.168 network. And then obviously public IPs will be routable on the open internet because they are unique worldwide. So some terms that we need to cover for NAT. Inside means I have control. I configure these devices. Outside is going to mean outside of my network. I don't have any control of that. Inside local will mean the private IP inside my network. Whereas inside global is going to mean the public IP that I want to translate my private IPs to before sending them out across the internet. Outside local and global, those are basically not my concern because I don't have any control over them. Static is going to mean a one-to-one translation if we're doing static NAT. Dynamic will mean a many-to-many translation. Usually you can use an ACL to define your local IPs and then a pool to determine your global IPs. And then PAT is going to be a many-to-one translation, where you're going to be adding a port number for uniqueness or overloading. And that's something that the router will handle for you. So some new commands that we're going to learn in this section will be show IP NAT translations. This will just display the different NAT translations that the router has performed. Show IP NAT statistics. This will display your inside and outside interfaces, NAT pools, ACLs, etc. IP NAT, inside or outside, this is going to specify an interface location relative to the network. So you need to be inside of the interface configuration before you issue this command. IP NAT pool, followed by the pool name, a start IP, end IP, the keyword net mask, and then the subnet mask. Will configure a NAT pool of public addresses to translate your private IPs into. IP NAT inside source static, followed by an optional protocol, your local address, and then the global address, will configure static NAT, essentially translating that local private IP into that global IP every time it crosses your router. IP NAT inside source static with that protocol, a local address, and a port, and then a global address and a port is going to configure static PAT or port forwarding. IP NAT inside source list followed by an ACL list, the keyword pool, and then a pool name will configure dynamic NAT, essentially translating any IP address that was in this ACL list inside your network into any global address that was specified in this pool before it leaves your network. Up next, IP NAT inside source list with that ACL list followed by the keyword interface and then an interface number and then the keyword overload will configure dynamic PAT. Essentially that'll take any private IP in this ACL list and translate it into the public IP address that is configured on this interface number, and then it'll add a port number of its choosing to that address so that it can retranslate it back when the message comes back across the internet. If you issue the clear IP NAT translations with a star, that'll clear your NAT translations. And finally, if you issue the command show control-plane host open-ports, you can see connections that have been made to your device. Now some simple steps that you can follow when configuring NAT or PAT is to specify the inside and outside interfaces, specify your local addresses with an ACL if need be, specify your global addresses with a pool, and then specify your NAT type, like IP NAT inside. Alright, so moving on here, I've prepared some examples. There's often nothing better than actually seeing it in action to help something stick in your mind. So if we hop into our practice router over here, we can go ahead and get into global configuration mode. We'll start with this first example of static NAT. So we issue this command, IPNAT inside source static 192.168.0.1. That's going to be our local private IP address. And then 135.8.20.4, that'll be the global address to translate it into. Enter. We've essentially just told our router if this address comes across your border of 192.168.0.1 heading out, go ahead and translate it into 135.8.20.4. And if it's coming in the other direction as 135.8.20.4, go ahead and translate it back into that 192 address. The next example is static PAT. We issue the next command, IPNAT inside source static TCP 192.168.0.1 with a port number of 80 and then 12.0.0.7 with also a port number of 80. That command essentially will redirect traffic from that global 12.IP into the local 192 IP if it comes in over port 80. Next, we'll go ahead and go through an example of dynamic NAT. So for this one, we're going to configure an access list to specify our local addresses or our private addresses. We'll issue this command, access-list1 permit 192.168.0.0, 0.0.0.31. Then we'll go ahead and define a pool of global addresses that we have been given that we can translate these private addresses into. So IPNAT pool, we'll call it pool 20.20.20.1, 20.20.20.32. That's the range of addresses in our pool with a net mask of 255.255.255.0. And then finally, we'll go ahead and issue the IPNAT inside source with that list number 1 and that pool of pool. And that will create those NAT translations that any of those addresses that come in from our private side in the 192 range will be translated to the next available address in the 20 network that we've given it. Final example that we'll go over will be dynamic PAT. So if we issue another access list, we'll go ahead and name this one access list 2 so we don't overwrite number 1. And we'll say permit 192.168.0.0, 0.0.0.127 for our local addresses. Then we'll do IPNAT inside source that list number of 2, but this time we're going to use interface G001 as our IP address that they'll all be translated to, and we'll issue the keyword overload. And essentially this is just saying add a port number onto these so that you can keep track of them and keep them separate when they're being translated back. You could also specify a pool instead of just this one interface, and you could still use the keyword overload if you had more than one public IP address that you wanted to translate to, but not enough public IP addresses to cover all of your internal private ones. Now obviously we're not done with just this step because none of this has been applied to anything. In order to actually have this work, we would have to go into each of our interfaces. So if we went into G000, we would have to say, hey, this is IPNAT inside. This is facing into my network. And then if we went into our other interface facing outside, we would have to say IPNAT outside. And now that would be fully configured to be able to perform NAT or PAT across our router. And we could verify some of these configurations by issuing some of our show commands that we learned earlier, such as show IPNAT translations. And there we can see our static translations that will happen no matter what. And then if we were to issue traffic over the dynamic translations, we would see this populate more as they get dynamically translated. So that was just a brief intro to network address translation. This is a very important and powerful configuration tool that you have in networking, and I definitely recommend that you go out and you study more about it. And if you haven't already, go to the video description below and click on that link and download this material for your notes as well as for the lab that will be coming up in the next video so that you can try it out for yourself or so that you can just follow along with us. With that said, we'll see you in the next one.